Professor Paul Wilkinson was a true giant, a colossus of the field of terrorism studies. In the United Kingdom, he was the leading scholar of terrorism for getting on for 4 decades, and the person who did more than any other individual, apart from perhaps terrorists themselves, to ensure that terrorism was taken seriously as a serious subject, deserving serious research. Internationally, he was one of a mere handful of academics who way back in the 1970s, my battered copy of Political Terrorism here, I see with shock, was first published in 1974. One of a handful of people that early who, in the face of often entrenched skepticism, hostility, and let's be honest, academic snobbery, fought to establish research and scholarly interchange concerning terrorism and what we should do about it to huge success. And he was always part of, I think, of Paul Wilkinson's approach that there should be a deep and practical engagement with the policy world. And I think that was part of the reason he was so well known outside of the academy, and much of the reason for his well-deserved Commander Order of the British Empire, CBE, in 2009. Over that long career, he produced a series of really quite foundational works, some of which still grace our reading lists, including Political Terrorism, which I've just mentioned, 1974, Terrorism in the Liberal State, 1977, and Terrorism versus Democracy, the last edition of which I believe was 2006. And that interest in how democracies should react to terrorism whilst remaining true to liberal democratic values continues to inform much of the reading and teaching at CSTPV today. And it is a daunting back catalogue for any visiting speaker to try and live up to. However, I have little doubt that tonight's speaker is well equal to the task of the other half of tonight's agenda, which is very much the looking forward. Tonight, we welcome Paul Gill, Professor of Security and Crime Science at University College London, to give our 2021 memorial lecture. I hope he will forgive my saying that his career appears, at least from the outside, not to have taken the usual form of a slow and steady march through various academic institutions of ascending prestige, so much as a sort of brisk apotheosis. His PhD was not much more than a decade ago, back in 2009, and it won deservedly an award on the subject of suicide bombing, and has led to a meteoric rise to his chair now at UCL via, I believe, only one relatively swift detour to Penn State University, which is an extraordinary record. So too is his research output. When I looked earlier this afternoon on the UCL website, there were 86 publications listed, but that was a couple of hours ago, and I don't know, it may have clocked up since. It's worth saying that he's not just prolific, though, that there is quality in that flood tide of publications. It has sometimes been said of terrorism, and sometimes with some terrorism studies, I should say, and sometimes with some degree of truth to it, that enormous edifices of scholarship are erected on rather wobbly empirical foundations. To borrow a phrase from the playwright Tom Stoppard, it's like Michelangelo working in polystyrene. It is fair to say that tonight's speaker does not work in the academic equivalent of polystyrene, and overall he has done probably more than anyone to champion data-driven approaches in this contested field. He's relentlessly driven forward an approach to interpreting the causes, the processes, and the consequences of violent extremism that is both methodologically robust and resiliently and resolutely evidence-based. His research interests range widely from suicide bombing, terrorist weaponry, propaganda, language use, sort of prosopography of the IRA, a collective biography, mental illness and political violence, dynamics of membership and networks, and so on. He has won a slew of major research grants from major bodies such as the Department of Homeland Security in the States, the European Union, Public Safety Canada. And that huge, successful track record of winning research grants has, as I say, underpinned that enormous tranche of publications that he has offered us. He is also the author of the seminal Lone Actor Terrorists, a Behavioural Analysis, Routledge 2016. Here's my well-thumbed copy. A book that does a truly excellent job of systematically collating and presenting what is known about lone actor terrorists. As an aside, if you'll forgive me, its preface is also notable for a memorable self-portrait of the author cowering in his conservatory with a locked door and young children hammering on the other side of it, a sort of behavioural analysis of the academic author under stress. So, in summary, the Paul Wilkinson Memorial Lecture is a traditional occasion for us to look forward as well as back. It is therefore all the more appropriate that Professor Gill should speak to us tonight on the distinctly forward-leaning title, quote, "What is a risk factor for violent extremism?" If I can just draw your attention to the boring housekeeping stuff of sort of remembering to keep your microphones off if you can, so that your own domestic or the domestic mayhem we may all be fighting in the background doesn't disturb tonight's speaker, and we can pay all due attention to what he has to say. Paul, you are extremely welcome, albeit virtually, to a virtual CSTPV, and the virtual floor is virtually yours. Over to you.
Thank you very much for the very kind introduction. Just trying to share my screen here. Can you see it?
Yep, all good.
Okay. All right, cool. So yeah, thanks very much for the very kind introduction. I can't help but feel that it's going to be a major letdown from here on out. But there is a likelihood that there will be children banging on the door as well. So at least there'll be some mild comic relief through it. It's a major honor to come and speak with you today. Without a shadow of a doubt, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Paul Wilkinson's body of work, both in terms of sort of almost single-handedly building this as a discipline, but also as an undergraduate almost 20 years ago. One of his books was an assigned reading on a sort of political communication course, and that sort of series of work by Paul led me to sort of immersing myself in the sort of emergent literature that was available at the time, and getting in touch with John Horgan, who was obviously very close with Paul Wilkinson, and sort of developing a research stream from there. I sort of kind of quite like unfairly got a lot of the plaudits in the opening kind of speech there by Tim. The sort of product of everything that we're talking about today was a product of teamwork, both that work that was carried out at Penn State under John Horgan, and then much later at University College London with my colleague Noemi Buhana. The two of us run a research group on counter-terrorism, and we've had just an incredible run of hiring some of the sort of best and bright young minds as PhDs and postdocs. So I'll be giving various people a shout out over the course of this. Okay, hopefully you can see my slides. So today's topic, which I gave quite a while ago, was what is a risk factor for violent extremism? And basically the sort of format of tonight's talk is to walk you through the kind of last 10 years of work that we've been doing, a sort of very abridged version of what we've been doing for the last 10 years. I personally sort of went into this kind of area of research quite naive to what we should be doing and what we could potentially do, and sort of incrementally over time we've kind of built a knowledge base and a research agenda where I kind of feels we have a lot better grasp of what we need to do for the next 10 years. And so I'm going to sort of walk you through where we've been and where we've kind of came from. So the very sort of first kind of question that we were posed with in 2011, we were funded by Department of Homeland Security to build a empirical database of lone actor terrorists. There was a lot of interest from practitioners, both in America and in Canada and across Europe. They were sort of seeing their caseload, increasing numbers of lone actors, and felt that there was very little in the academic research literature that could inform their operational decision making. What was there were largely case studies, really rich case studies of very, very famous cases like McVeigh and Unabomber and other kind of, big standout lone actors that caught the popular imagination. But there was very little sort of sense of whether they kind of typified what a lone actor looked like, what kind of generalizations could be made from those case studies. And as I said, there was very little that could feed into things like how do we approach new referrals in the lead space from a counterterrorism thing. If we have loads of leads at the same time, they can't really inform how we prioritize cases and triage and make sure that the kind of highest risky ones get a sufficient level of coverage to do a full assessment. There was very little insights about how we can sort of manage potential threats and manage downward the risk that many people faced. How can we close cases? How can we be sufficiently happy and justified that the risk has ebbed away or that there's no sort of prominent risk facing? And there was very little kind of insights that could be got from like re-engagement and recidivism, which are obviously very hot topics now today, with the volume of terrorism act offenders that are in prisons across Europe that are facing release into the community in the coming years or even in the last few years, as well as individuals returning from conflict in foreign lands in Syria and so on. And so it was kind of quite a large task that we had that I absolutely naively went into. I genuinely felt when I started that project on lone actors, that we would do it for a year, answer all the questions, and then go back to like studying Northern Irish based conflicts. You know, it's been 10 years now and we still haven't been able to sort of push away this kind of risk assessment stuff. So, and we've got like a large agenda for where we're going forward with it. The very first step that we were faced with was essentially kind of getting prevalence rates for the various different risk factors that potentially are risk factors for lone actor terrorism, right? So we collected a large bunch of names of people across all different ideologies who tried to conduct an act of terrorism by themselves on the day of the violence, right? So that was our sort of cutoff criteria. Was the plan for them to do violence by themselves? And then we were sort of faced on day one of the project with, okay, what risk factors are we going to collect information on, right? And there wasn't a great deal of guidance available to us from the terrorism studies literature. Up until that time, there'd kind of been almost two sides of a debate. One side that like pathologized terrorists, and that was largely kind of unempirical, that sort of threw out some kind of hypotheses about what must drive their behavior purely based off of the often, you know, kind of savage acts of violence that they would conduct. And then they would sort of reverse engineer a kind of a theory about what drives that person. And then on the other hand, you had this sort of other wave of scholars who were basically saying there is no such thing as a profile, that, you know, there is no real evidence base behind any of these arguments, that instead we need to sort of understand the kind of and build theoretical conceptual frameworks about how it's a pathway into the violence. So we kind of on that start of that project situated ourselves almost in the middle of this debate. We said, okay, it is likely to be a pathway. It is likely the final act of violence is likely to be a culmination of a series of sequential steps that got the perpetrator to that point. There's probably a lot of push and pull factors. So let's try to basically specify all the possible ones we can think of and then search for whether they occurred in each of our lone actors or not. So it was simply to sort of get a sense of how often do different lone actors experience different risk factors and different behaviors that got them to the point where they were mobilizing towards violence. So simply sort of simple counts of how often different risk factors occurred. And very early on, we kind of had to define what all of these potential risk factors were that we were going to collect information on. And we did it in sort of three ways kind of influenced us. We went into those conceptual models about terrorist radicalization and basically pinpointed all of the different types of behaviors that were said to be crucial. So, Sageman's argument about, a bunch of guys theory was very prominent at the time. So we coded for whether the individual had sort of hung out with other like-minded individuals or deviant peers. We also pulled in risk factors from the general violence risk assessment literature, which is much more long-standing, thousands of papers every single year, lots and lots of meta-analyses. So we pulled in risk factors from there. And we also looked in parallel research fields like threat assessments, where there was this thriving research literature looking at risk factors for making threats to public figures and things like this. So we built this really long list of potential risk factors and went through sort of a systematic data collection on everything that was out there and available, publicly available on each of our lone actors that we could identify. In that first project, we could identify 119 lone actor terrorists. And we identified something like 180 potential risk factors from the wider research literatures that we were looking at. So it's a bit of a problem when you can find far more potential risk factors than you can individuals themselves. And the sort of first study that came out of that was Bombing Alone, which is, looking back on it, I don't think I realized kind of how novel the kind of results were at the time. There was very, very few, if any, papers at the time that could specify how many people within a sample of violent extremists had criminal backgrounds or had mental health disorders diagnosed prior to their offending, or how many of them were in the throes of psychological distress from a loss of a job, a breakdown in a family relationship, financial stress. There was a whole heap of potential risk factors that paper is the sort of first to kind of systematically collect data on. And I suppose one of the kind of take-home points from that paper was that really violent extremists, in terms of their backgrounds, in terms of their risk factors, they don't look too different from lots of other types of violent offenders in terms of the types of risk factors that drove them to the point where they decided to engage in violence, and in terms of their prevalence rates within that particular sample. And soon after that paper was published, I moved to the UK to work at UCL, and some of our research was getting a lot of traction and interest from various different police forces. And we collaborated with the Greater Manchester Police to have access to police and intelligence data, offender interviews with family members of the person, to sort of get a sense of whether what we could find in open sources could be validated with these closed sources. And again, we found really, really similar rates in their background behaviors, their experiences, the kind of length of time it took to mobilize towards violence. And that essentially, there is no one single lone actor profile. There's no one pathway into violence, but there's a set of factors that we can draw on to try and understand the sort of what drove that person to engage in that violence, and a set of sort of background features, which we'll talk about a little bit more. But again, the sort of purpose here was just basically to put a number on how often different behaviors occurred in the backgrounds. And when I started that 1 year lone actor project, I thought that would be sufficient enough. I felt that was novel enough that we could make a mark with that alone and sort of, again, go back to doing the IRA stuff. And usually when we looked into our lone actors, there was never just one kind of silver bullet explanation that we could use to explain how one person could get over the line. Usually there was a mixture of complex needs in their backgrounds at the time that they became exposed to the radicalizing materials. So things like sort of a history of antisocial cognitions, substance abuse, childhood trauma, identity issues, deviant peers, housing, behavioral problems, relationship instability. It was never just one. Typically, it was a combination of multiple different factors. No two people looked exactly the same, but they had lots of risk factors and lots of stressors ongoing at the time that they either got exposed to radicalizing material or mobilized to violence on behalf of an ideological cause. There was no kind of easy answer. It was really, really complex. And it was almost that sort of complexity, which is what kept me hanging around doing research on this topic. So we kind of got to the end of the project. We gave a really decent descriptive analysis of who these people were and how often different potential risk factors were present in that sample. So the next kind of questions we started getting from people and from practitioners and from other sort of scientific outlets was, well, how, so what if 40% of them have a mental health disorder? How does this compare to other offender types or compare to other types of terrorists? So we were faced with this next question about, okay, we got a really good understanding of lone actors and their backgrounds, but how generalizable is this to other forms of terrorists? And one of those particular ideas was around mental health problems. And we kind of quickly realized, well, this first project took about 5,500 hours of coder time. We had 24 undergraduate coders giving us 10 hours a week on that first project. So we were going to have to sort of find a way of maintaining a large amount of data to be coded in order to do these comparisons. That it wasn't enough just to do a descriptive analysis. We needed to start going through that same systematic procedure for other types of data and to be on the lookout for other data opportunities at all times to really try to go that next step and validate the factors that we felt were important for explaining lone actors. And the first bit of work was around mental health problems, really. And again, it was one of those sort of happy accidents. When we published the first study, the bombing alone study, and we noted that somewhere between 30 and 40% had a mental health disorder diagnosed, we only talk about it really for like a small paragraph and then say, we don't know if this is important or not. Further work will be done. But we noticed that a lot of the early citations of that paper really grabbed hold of the prevalence rate that we had put on mental health disorders being diagnosed. And a lot of people miscited our work to say, look, they've shown that a large minority of them have a mental health disorder diagnosed. Therefore, many lone actors are irrational, spontaneous, hard to predict, that they basically betray any type of academic insights. We can't try and understand them. And that wasn't the sort of purpose of our paragraph whatsoever. We were trying to caveat it to death. So it needed more work to be done to sort of strengthen what our conclusions were around that particular issue. And I was very lucky that we at the time, Noemi Bahana runs a Countering Organised Crime and Terrorism Master's course at UCL. And one of our students was Emily Corner, who did this piece of work as her master's dissertation and then has gone on to be a very prolific author herself. And we built a sort of a comparison group of terrorists who offended as part of a group. So who plans to perpetrate the violence with co-offenders. And we did a match sample based on demographic information and ideological backgrounds. And what this paper found was that our lone actor terrorists were almost 13.5 times more likely than a group-based terrorist to have a mental illness diagnosed. And that, these kind of poor citations that we were getting, which said, well, if you've got mental health problems, therefore you're irrational, just didn't have any empirical proof behind it. Basically, we showed that those lone actors who had a disorder diagnosed were just as likely as those without a diagnosis to engage in careful planning, rational choice type decisions about the costs of going at certain targets and the benefits of going after other targets. They were just as likely to be rational and purposive in their decision making. But lone actors did have a greater rate of mental health disorders diagnosed. So again, one of the other sort of takeaway points that we came from this particular paper was we found maybe 10 or 12 other studies that compared lone offenders to group offenders across a wide range of other types of crime. So sexual violence, burglary, homicide, armed robbery. And each of those studies found the same thing, that the lone offenders were significantly more likely to have mental health disorders diagnosed than those who co-offended as part of a group. So it was another sort of a tick box in our journey through this research field to say, here's another finding that we're getting from the wider general violence literature that is also applicable to the political violence literature, that maybe there's a lot more learning that can be done from that field that we haven't done to date. And another sort of comparison that we did, we looked at mass murderers, so people who conducted really similar types of violence to lone actor terrorists. So people who went to a public space, killed 4 or more in a 24-hour period, but absent of an overarching political, religious, or social cause. So the violence looked really similar to lone actors, but the overtly stated motivation was political, was personal, rather than the lone actor terrorists who was often political. And basically, we found in this study that they look really, really similar to the lone actors. They're basically the same pool of people who are aggrieved about slightly different things. And when we started doing our deep dive on the case studies, you scratch below the surface of a lone actor's ideology, quite often you found that there were personal grievances wrapped up in their decision making. So Anders Breivik's ideology is all about anti-immigration, but the people he decided to attack on the day were organizations that he felt had sort of let him down, that had gotten his way, that had refused to publish his work. He was planning to target newspapers and magazines as well at one time, that refused to publish his writings. So it was like personal grievances wrapped up in it as well. And when we started looking at like the school shooters and the mass murder types, we often found that actually what they were saying kind of had lots of political and social motifs behind it, but it just didn't have that sort of same critical mass of followers who would consume it. But some of those people who could have made our database, like Elliot Rodger, he was an incel, part of that movement. Now, there's a case over in Canada that was, people looked at it under terrorism law to see whether he should have been convicted underneath that. So some contexts, a person might emerge and do an act of violence and it be treated as mass murder. But in other contexts, if there's a larger degree of support, social support, or a wider social milieu, they'll be treated like a terrorist. But both of these things in the research literature had often been treated as being completely different entities. But our work showed that they have a really similar genesis, that there's similar kind of drivers and stressors and push and pull factors into these types of violence. So again, we can glean more insight, including in things like the degree to which other people know something about the perpetrators' attitudes, beliefs, intentions, and plans for the violence. We sort of showed there's high degrees of it in both lone actors and in our mass murderers. So again, I felt at the end of that sort of second wave of studies that we'd be able to sort of get back and start doing the IRA stuff again. And then it started to emerge more questions from practitioners and more questions from scientific audiences that perhaps comparing to group-based terrorists and comparing to mass murderers is not the best type of control group if you're really trying to scientifically validate risk factors. And really up until that point, the purpose that I was on wasn't to scientifically validate anything. It was just to sort of describe that pool of people and describe their pathway to violence. It was only really when we got to this stage that I started realizing what was kind of needed to scientifically validate a lot of risk factors, whether they should be included in risk assessments and tools and things like that. And, you know, things kind of escalated quite quickly, because we went from a point in 2011 where we felt what we were doing was really, really novel in just describing the behavioral features of a data set. A sort of a whole wave of similar types of studies came soon after. And I'm not saying that we inspired it. I think it was Mark Sageman's work that really inspired a lot of people to start kind of carefully and meticulously, maybe much more than Sageman did, and transparently reports the kind of data that underpins the analyses. So when we started trying to publish in, you know, the sort of higher end criminology and psychology journals, often the feedback was, you need to go get a real control group. And in the sort of the general violence literature, it's often a lot easier comparatively to find those control groups. So typically the vast majority of that literature focuses on recidivism. So they take a pool of people that are released from prison or from some form of institution. They do a follow-up after 2 years and see who has gone back to violence and compare their background features to those who did not go back to violence. So they've got like basically a ready-made sample to go back and study to sort of see what is a risk factor for recidivism. Fortunately, we don't have that in terrorism studies, right? Because there's comparatively far fewer people that are convicted of terrorism that we can do a follow-up on. So we had to develop our control groups from elsewhere to try and really amp up the scientific validation of them. At a very early stage, one of the sort of the sole potential risk factor that we had available data on, because of the array of epidemiological studies that are available, was in the area of mental health disorders and the levels of diagnoses that are out there in modern Western developed countries. So we had all of these epidemiological studies, which some meta-analyses put the average rate around 26%. So most developed countries will have 1 in 4 of their population will be diagnosed with a mental health disorder at some point in their life. So it's a lot higher than a lot of people kind of realize. So we can kind of compare it to the different data samples that we had in basically within the research group. And again, we sort of demonstrate that the higher degrees of co-offending in our samples lead to lower, are related to lower and lower diagnoses of mental health disorders. So you can see our lone actor, the kind of latest iteration of our lone actor data collection, has the rates diagnosed at just over 40%. So there's an elevated level compared to what we would expect by chance, right? And at this point in time, that's kind of how I would have defined what a risk factor is. So a risk factor is something that might elevate the likelihood that you'll engage in a behavior of concern or potentially harmful behavior. And the other half of that coin is that it needed to be present within your offender group to a greater extent than it is within some form of decent control group. So you needed elevated levels of it, and it needed to play a role, a potential role in escalating somebody's chances of engaging in harmful behavior. And when we started sort of breaking down the kind of level, the types of diagnoses that we had within our data, what we found with our lone actors was generally there was significantly greater rates of schizophrenia, delusional disorder, autism spectrum, but significantly lower rates of depression, anxiety, and sleep disorder. So again, sort of another hallmark of the type of work we try to do is we try and disaggregate things as much as possible, break them apart, and build it back up again. So whilst these diagnoses are elevated levels of likelihood within our lone actors, can we really say that sort of having a mental health disorder is a risk factor for lone actor terrorism? I don't think so necessarily. The vast majority of people that have these disorders do not go on to engage in violence, let alone terrorism violence. They're much more likely to engage in violence against themselves than in violence against other people. But given its level of elevated levels of it occurring compared to chance, it might be something that people would need to assess and consider in thinking about how do we manage potential people. And really what the sort of result calls for is that it is insufficient for a police officer by themselves or an intelligence officer by themselves to be able to make these assessments. And that really what we need is kind of multi-agency teams, each with their own sort of skill set, who will be able to look at the different types of people that will naturally come in from different types of referrals. We also know, though, when I'm talking about sort of disaggregating what it is that we're studying, that particular slide that you're looking at now, or at least I hope I've shared it properly and you're all looking at it and not just in silence looking at a black screen, is just on our lone actors. Similar data is out there on people that go through channel, which is much further upstream prevention. In that sample, we also find increased rates compared to what you would expect of psychotic disorder, autism spectrum. But in this sample, we find significantly higher rates of depression and anxiety, whereas with our lone actor terrorists, we found significantly lower rates of depression and anxiety. So again, going back to that sort of first principles on how we started this project, is that lone actor terrorism is likely the culmination of a number of discrete steps that people may have to step through to get to that point of violence. Here in this particular phase where people are, at the early stages of getting radicalized or the early stages of sort of hanging out in radicalizing settings, we find a slightly different parts of the population compared to those who go on to engage in violence. So significantly lower rates of depression and anxiety here, significantly greater rates of it here. So we might say that, depression and anxiety might be a risk factor for getting to the point of being radicalized, but might be a protective factor against going to that next stage and turning those attitudes and beliefs into violent expressions. So again, we need to sort of be able to pick these things apart and embrace the kind of complexity that is out there within the data results themselves. So that was based on the kind of available epidemiological studies that were out there, where we grabbed the kind of rates of mental health disorders diagnosed within the population. And then much more recently, last year, we published what we call the base rate study, where we went out to specify how often all of these risk factors that we've gathered information on occur within a general population. So, it's partially a methods paper to sort of outline what's the best way of gathering really sensitive information and get people to sort of disclose it to make sure that there's a great deal of fidelity in the data. And then the second half of the paper sort of compares these 2,100 people who told us really kind of intimate details about their life and compared them to our lone actor terrorists. And what we essentially find in that study is we kind of validate the sort of big 8 risk factors that are out there for general violence recidivism. So we find that our lone actor terrorists, compared to these 2,000 people we collected information on, were significantly more likely to have antisocial cognitions, to have engaged in a range of antisocial, criminal, violent behavior. Their lone actors were significantly more likely to have kind of deviant peers or, hang around with people that have similar extreme ideologies. The general population themselves were significantly more likely to have a range of other types of risk factors, and stressors. But typically what happened with those people were that they occurred alongside a wide range of what we would consider protective factors. So, you know, like gainful employment, to be engaged in some form of educational activity, to have pro-social friends and family, to have a wide range of sort of protective influences in their life. So when we did find some risk factors were occurring in the general population more often, we also found that there was these protective factors which were acting as a buffer, which were stopping that person from engaging in criminal or harmful behaviors. So this particular study started to change my mind about what a risk factor looks like. And I stopped thinking of it in terms of, well, it has to be more prevalent in our terrorists versus the general population. And I stopped thinking of it in those kind of binary ways and started thinking of it as a sort of a collection of factors together, right? And the more we can embrace those complexities and formulate our understanding of somebody's risk, the better and more individually tailored the interventions can be. So it was less about, do these behaviors occur more with terrorists, and more about, are there things that are acting as an insurance policy for the individual to stop them from engaging in harmful behaviors? So that's when we started thinking about things slightly more differently. But with our lone actors, we did find, you know, lower rates of self-control, higher rates of previous violence, much higher rates of substance abuse, much more higher rates of criminality, and so on. So there was a lot of factors that were more prevalent in our lone actors. But then there was other kind of family and financial stressors, which were much more relevant in the general population. But it seemed these protective factors acted as that kind of crucial buffer. So as I'll talk about later on, one of the kind of big things that me and Noemi and the research group will be looking at over the coming years is really to try and get a handle on on protective factors much more so. Okay, so again, you know, a lot of the lone actors was the gateway into this piece of research. So we felt we needed to sort of move beyond that there was kind of only so far we could get with our sample of 150 odd lone actors and 120 mass murderers, and we needed to kind of look beyond it and see what else kind of types of data we could get our hands on to sort of push the research agenda even forward, even more, you know, even greater down the line. So I kind of think of radicalization, or the research literature, depending on what study you look at, treats radicalization slightly different from study to study. And what I've talked about so far is our lone actors. So that's the sort of the end, right? It's the kind of violent expressions of everything else. It's the behavior. We hadn't collected any data in terms of beliefs or attitudes or intentions, those kind of earlier phases that we might be able to kind of roughly draw lines around on people's mobilization into violence. Each of these are sort of slightly different things, right? So a belief is just a general belief that you hold about the world. So I believe that Guinness is good for me. Attitude kind of goes a step further. So because I believe Guinness is good for me, my attitude is that I should drink as much of it as possible. My intention is therefore to go to the off license immediately after this and buy a lot of Guinness. And then my behavior will be to consume all of the Guinness that I can get my hands on. Each of those are slightly different things, and there might be different risk factors or influences which explain each of those 4 different steps. So there won't be one single factor that explains everything. There might be different factors that explain each of these kind of phases. In the same way we talked earlier about depression and radicalization, and, you know, again, looking a deep dive into those cases, you know, you might think about people being in the throes of depression, being stuck at home, lack of pro-social engagement with other people, sort of a general despondency, maybe a sort of reliance on the online space, maybe potentially finding themselves in the wrong space, but not really feeling that they can go and do anything about this new belief and attitude system that they've developed, right? So, for example, my belief that Guinness is good for me might be driven by the fact that I'm Irish, and that when you leave Ireland and drink it elsewhere, it's just nowhere near as good, right? So I believe it's good for me because it's developed close to home and it's real Irish water that goes into it. My attitude might be explained by something other than the fact that I'm from here. Maybe my attitude that I should go and drink as much of it as possible might be a socially learned behavior because it's what I saw family members do, it's what my friends do, things like that. So there might be different influences. Maybe my intentions to go and get Guinness straight after this, maybe that might be driven by situational influences. There's no rain outside. It's going to be easy for me to cross the road and get to the off license. I have disposable income to pay for that Guinness. And maybe the behavior of drinking all that Guinness might be driven by my addictive personality traits. So I don't do many things in life, but when I do it, I sort of go to the nth degree with it. So this is a sort of very facetious way of trying to say that different factors can explain different parts of somebody's journey to the end point of the behavior, and that it's really all of these things that come together that produce the outcome. And I'm not an alcoholic, by the way, just before anybody does an intervention. So we kind of think about beliefs and attitudes in the UK as being a sort of a part of the prevent process, right? So if people have the beliefs and the attitudes, but haven't mobilized to violence or don't have intentions to mobilize to violence, they're often dealt with in the prevent space because it's upstream. It's not a policing or intelligence operation that needs to manage that person. But when they move to a behavioral intention to do something violent, or to travel further afield, or to collect money for a movement, and when they actually go on to do those behaviors, we think of them as sort of in that kind of pursue space. There's different types of research designs that we've got available to us as researchers to try to pinpoint and collect data at each of these kind of four components. One of these kind of work that we've done is with the Fixated Threat Assessment Centre in London. This is a multi-agency unit that manages the risk posed by the fixated individuals with British public figures, the royal family, politicians from time to time, and so on. We got working with these guys because they had read our initial lone actor work, and in sort of the descriptive analyses that we had published on, they felt that there was a high degree of overlap with lone actor terrorists and a sort of a portion of their caseload. So, and they had done a lot of really, really great research. We had read a lot of it in our early development of the lone actor work. And Emily Corner went on to sort of be based out of the Fixated Threat Assessment Centre for a couple of years and coded over 2,000 individual cases of people that made threatening communications or sort of worrying approaches to British public figures, and a mixture of sort of police and health data. And one of the really nice things about this data is that whereas our lone actor terrorists, every single one of them got to the end point of mobilizing for violence, this particular data set has a mixture of those who expressed intentions to do something and those who actually followed up and tried to do something. So we have that sort of variance in our dependent variable, right, which social scientists tend to like. So if we compare those people who made an approach, who sort of got close to the target that they were fixated with, and, you know, we use approach as a proxy figure for a greater degree of risk because they got close to the target, so they had greater opportunity to do something very harmful for the target. When we compare those people to those who just make noise and sit on their hands and never do anything, we can see sort of three major risk factors that sort of spring out of the data that help kind of parse those two groups apart, the sort of signal from the noise. overt mental disorder, they're almost half as likely to make an approach. Those with a criminal history and those with a history of violence. So again, these are some of the sort of classic things that often come out in big studies of recidivism, were also applicable in this particular space. Although they're not sort of terrorists by definition, I think that there is a high degree enough of overlap between this sample and many of our lone actors for it to sort of warrant kind of insight into potentially future terrorism risk assessment guidances. And then going back to our base rate study that I spoke about earlier, that was published earlier last year, we asked a portion of this population, a third of them, so around 700, if they had engaged in a range of behaviours related to exposure to extremism. So had they viewed extremist propaganda, had they interacted online with extremists, did they have close associates involved in extremism, or did they themselves once hold extremist beliefs? This particular paper is published, but we've since replicated it with a nationally representative UK sample of 1,500 people, and the results are really similar. So what were the kind of, and what we found was, so we collapsed all of those exposure type behaviors, and we looked to see, what are the types of predictors of who starts engaging with the materials and who starts like holding these types of beliefs. And what we found in our data was that there's loads of sort of statistically significant correlations for who engages with extremist materials, beliefs, and the settings that extremists hang out in. But they all had really quite small effect sizes. So again, it sort of goes back to that kind of argument that really there is no silver bullet, one risk factor that we need to be looking out for, but it's this sort of cascading effect of multiple risk factors going on in somebody's life that might help explain who does these behaviors and who doesn't. But sort of 4 of the ones with the highest effect sizes within the data were people who self-reported being a victim of prejudice or injustice in the previous year. So maybe that's where we start to see some of the kind of differences come out from violent extremism risk assessments versus general violence risk assessments, right? Because there is this kind of social, political explanation for their behaviors. So they tie their personal experiences of prejudice and wrap it up into a wider ideology. And those who self-reported being under psychological distress in the previous year were 57% more likely to have actively gone out and exposed themselves to extremist materials, their settings, and so on. And again, when you're thinking about what everybody has gone through in the last year with COVID and social isolation, and many people are psychologically distressed, that could present a bit of a worry for a potential uptake in the number of prevent referrals and counter and sort of terrorism acts referrals that come down the line as a byproduct of COVID. People who self-reported being thrill seekers and low in self-control were just as likely to be exposed as those that had self-reported psychological distress. And again, going back to that protective factors, those who self-reported being married were 42% less likely to be actively exposed. Now, obviously, some married people do expose themselves to extremist materials. Some people that are not thrill seekers do so as well. So what we're talking about here is general group level propensities. All of these stats won't give you, all these stats sort of give you a sense of what factors need to be looked at in a risk assessment. They won't give you sort of predictive power of a single individual if they're in front of you. And what you need to do is sort of do a much more sort of qualitative understanding of that individual's highly individualized set of drivers and circumstances. And sort of getting towards the sort of conclusion here, I can't really think of a better term for it. I don't really like perfect storms, but I couldn't find one that was better for today. But essentially, what I'm talking about is the sort of next level of research designs that we've been doing for the last couple of years. that many of our research team members have taken the lead on, and which tries to build in as many of these risk factors as possible to sort of show these cascading effects that they have basically a multiplier effect upon one another. And because again, I'm often sort of frustrated in academic conferences on terrorism studies, or in Twitter debates, or in how research articles set themselves up, that there is often this sort of implicit assumption that there is one risk factor that's going to explain absolutely everybody. So we often have this debate in the literature about, is it ideology driving somebody, or is it a different set of drivers? As if they both can't be equally as true as one another. You take 10 individuals from a terrorist group, some will be motivated by some things, some will be motivated by other things. It's like a job. You're going to have different people motivated, doing the same job, but motivated for very, very different kind of reasons. Some of my PhD students might be motivated by their love of science. Some might be naively motivated by the money they think they're going to earn as an academic. Some people might be motivated by avoiding a real job, like I was. So, the sort of best, and I'm biased because she's my colleague and we shared an office for years, but the best kind of theoretical and sort of conceptual outline of what we're trying to achieve here is in that particular paper by Noemi, which was a part of the series of papers that were commissioned by the UK Commission for Countering Terrorism. And it's to encourage systems level thinking and to encourage our understanding across a number of different levels of analysis. I'm not even going to try to describe the theory because I have a feeling Noemi's on the line and I will feel her eyes rolling. But the one big quote that I always take from this particular paper when I return to it is, I think it encapsulates sort of where my thinking has gone to from the very simple understanding of what a risk factor was. So it's about trying to understand what kinds of people, in what kinds of contexts, at what times should be considered at risk. So what is a risk factor for one particular individual might actually be a protective factor in a different individual's context. And we need to sort of be able to take on these very complex understandings. There is going to be no simple answers to it. So again, naive old me thinking we'd have the answer in a year, and still we are here working at it. But I think this sentence itself sums up some of the difficulties in trying to understand it. What might be a risk factor for engagement in paramilitary groups in Northern Ireland might be really, really different for what is a risk factor for engagement in right-wing extremism in, Northern UK. So we took, one of the things that we tried to, again, situate ourselves in the middle of was that we had our studies which built a prevalence rates of all of these different risk factors. And then we, going back to the early lone actor work that other people had done, those big case studies, where they kind of tell a really rich story about how a person went from point zero to point explosion and kind of all the little intricacies that happened along the way. Our sort of statistical approaches had missed a lot of that. We were just counting how often things happened. We weren't outlining, well, this happens and then this tends to be the next behavior after it, and this tends to be the next behavior after that. So we could draw these correlations, but we didn't know in which direction those correlations were going. So again, another facetious example, in our data, we had this correlation between people who were married and people who had a mood disorder diagnosed. We didn't know if they had the mood disorder first, then got married, or if they got married and then later developed a mood disorder. We had no way of knowing because of the way we'd constructed the data. So we went back to it and recoded everything to basically give a sequence of behaviors that occurred with each of our lone actors, and to develop this kind of sequence analysis. So again, going back to that, a lot of our early citations of our mental health work miscited us, saying they show mental health disorders cause lone actor terrorism. That was absolutely not what we showed, and absolutely not what we were trying to say. This sequence analysis kind of gives a greater understanding of the complexity of it all, right? So over on the left-hand side, you might see, a mental health disorder being diagnosed. There's no real straight arrow towards that behavior of concern over on the right, the attack, right? Typically, the mental health problems precede either failure of bonding, so like social isolation, or they preceded the development of a personal grievance, or they typically preceded a sort of an emotional change, which was noticed by other people, or they preceded engagement in other forms of criminal violence. And then another behavior was more likely to occur. So it's sort of being able to depict and visualize the kind of the causes of the causes of the causes. And the factors that we've kind of mapped out here and demonstrate are from a threat assessment tool called the TRAP-18, but this could be applied to just about any type of risk assessment tool that's out there. But again, the sort of thinking here and the visualization shows the need for multi-agency approaches. Those behaviors that are on the left-hand side, the kind of causes of the causes of the causes, none of these things are a policing issue. None of these things are an intelligence issue, but they, for many of these lone actors, were the sort of first step in that kind of cascading effect of bad things happening in their life that led to the point where they decided to engage in violence on behalf of a cause. Again, much more recently, and we are coming towards a conclusion, we published another kind of nationally representative survey study where we did a phone survey with 1,500 people living in Germany. It was a sort of a surprise to us, first of all, that people would answer, that people had a landline, that people would answer their landline, and then people would stay on a landline for half an hour, answering questions about very sensitive parts of their life and their behaviors and their attitudes. And 4 of those questions was, we got people to rate on a scale of 1 to 7 the degree to which they agreed with the following statements. It's sometimes necessary to defend the values, convictions, religious beliefs of a group, or it's sometimes necessary to support groups that use violence, or use violence to fight injustice, or it's sometimes necessary to fight for a better world by using violence, committing attacks, or kidnapping people. So each of those bullet points are just a slightly more incremental extreme position on one another. And we wanted to sort of get an understanding of what were the factors which helped explain people having the sort of the most extreme radical intentions or belief systems that we could ask down the phone line. And again, a lot of the sort of design of this was heavily informed by the Noemi's report that I cited earlier on. And this particular structured equation model sort of demonstrates that, it's that sort of cascading effect of multiple risk factors. So people self-reporting, having a lot of individual strains and stressors in their life, that had a moderate impact upon the degree to which they self-reported feelings of anomie, feelings of being outside of society or being on the edges of society. Individuals that self-reported that they felt that their social identity was also under heavy degrees of strain and stress, were also more likely to report feeling on the edges of society. And those ones who kind of self-reported high levels of anomie were also significantly more likely to express high degrees of legal cynicism, to be cynical about the police, to be cynical about the laws that are around them, and basically to be cynical about the sort of democratic regime in which they live. Those people who were highly cynical about the laws and the institutions that uphold the laws had a really, really like a strong impact. They were strongly more likely to be exposed to extremist peers who themselves held kind of radical attitudes and radical beliefs. Those people with low self-control were also significantly more likely to be exposed to extremist peers. And all of that added together was likely to lead to violent extremist intentions. So it's never just one factor. It's the presence of one factor may make the presence of a second factor more likely. And if they're both present to a high degree, it may lead to the kind of harmful ends that we're talking about, or if 3 or 4 of them are there together. So, you can see the sort of straight line between legal cynicism and violent extremist intentions. It's 0.13, which is a low effect size. The effect size is almost kind of 4 times greater for them to be exposed to extremist peers. And when it goes through that route, the impact of high legal cynicism and being exposed to extremist peers is much more likely to lead to violent extremist intentions. So again, it's about that sort of snowball effect of multiple of these factors being present. And then next steps, looking forwards. So I kind of split this slide into 2 sections. So first of all, talking about the sort of science of risk assessment itself. I'm kind of at the point where I'm fairly reassured that the same types of highly validated risk factors that apply for general violence also apply for extremist violence on a group level scale. What we kind of need now is a greater understanding of the sort of the functional roles that these risk factors play into violent extremism. Because the functional roles whilst the risk factors might be the same, the functional roles might be slightly different. And to sort of really unpick those functional roles, I think we'll have to go back to your rich case studies, the rich, hard to generalize case studies, and slowly, incrementally build them up into a body of knowledge. There's a lot of really great research out there that relies on first-hand interviews, but often the purpose of those research designs isn't to inform risk assessments. It's for other purposes. It's to give a sort of a general outline of the sort of political dynamics within a terrorist group, or a kind of more generalized understanding of what the ideology meant for the person. They weren't designed for risk assessment practice in mind. So I think a lot of the research going forward, where the sort of great leaps forward will be made, is in trying to really understand the kind of relevance of a risk factor to violent extremist offending. So does substance abuse have the same functional roles for violent extremism as it does for general violence? I don't think so. I think there'll be slightly different kind of implications for it. I think there's a lot of work to be done, both conceptually and empirically, on protective factors. In general violence research, the vast majority of protective factor research that's out there is concerned with youth offending. Because you've got schools wrapped around the person, you have family wrapped around the person, so it's just generally easier to do those types of interventions. They're more of an accessible kind of place to collect data on for youth. I don't know if the same learning about youth populations can apply to all violent extremists. So there's a lot of work we need to do about protective factors. Is a protective factor the opposite of a risk factor? Is it the absence of a risk factor? Does it have a buffering role? And how do we design research to try and sort of set these different positions out? And, I think it's like, again, the sort of large, lengthy legacy that Paul Wilkinson has left behind him. A lot of the time, I imagine when he was kind of walking a lonely road in terrorism studies, where there was a high, a real lack of data, a real lack of sort of things going on because there was so few researchers. Then when I was doing my PhD, there was a lot of researchers, but everybody opens their talks with, obviously there's no data available on this, but here's my conceptual model. To the point that we have a huge expanding evidence base. And I think that there is a lot of opportunities now in a very short amount of time to conduct meta-analyses, replication type designs, to really get a handle on how do risk factors work in different contexts, which are applicable across a wide degree of context, and to do it in a sort of transparent, open science type way. In terms of the arts of risk assessments, you know, the sort of huge explosion in science in this space, we need to also make sure that we can translate the best available research for practice, and to make sure that the best available research is available for those who conduct risk assessments and management. I think, you know, if you think about the operational sphere over the last 10 years, it's changed hugely in the UK. A big uptake in extreme right, a big uptake in teenagers getting involved, and the types of risk factors that might have been applicable to those who offended as part of groups for Al-Qaeda might be in need of an update and a need for a greater elaboration of the context in which you might expect to find them. In general violence research, there's a real lack of evaluations about how risk assessment tools are used in practice. They're starting to sort of take hold, but we really don't have any that are in the public sphere in relation to violent extremism, how risk assessments impact upon the quality of evaluations. And then finally, you know, the art of it is sort of matching treatment to the needs of the offender, to not take interventions as a sort of a cut and paste, one size fits all, but how can we formulate an individual's risk factors and the things that brought them to offend, and best match interventions to try and address those problems. So yeah, so that's basically where I'm at right now. I mean, for those of you who hoped to sort of get a laundry list of risk factors, I'm sorry if the title misrepresented what it was. This was more of an outline of the kind of 10 years of work that we've been conducting and where we're hoping to go in the future. So thanks very much for listening.
Thank you for a very sure-footed survey of a very complex, fast-evolving landscape. Deeply appreciated, and also thank you for the disarming honesty with which you presented it, how easily a one-year research program can become 10 years and counting.